So, Angela, come on in. Tim and I have been talking about this a lot. What caught our attention was, this Iranian foreign minister meeting up with Russian President Vladimir Putin. In a previous segment, our own Ellen Milligan, who covers national security here, in talking with a British official, she said, what they are hearing is President Putin's hidden hand is behind a lot of this conflict. How do you see it?
Well, certainly Russia has been backing Iran since the United States and Israel attacked Iran. It's been providing the Iranians with intelligence on American targets, among other things. It's been providing the Iranians with an updated version of the Shahed drones, which the Iranians first provided the Russians to use in Ukraine. Russians have now modernized them, so they've been giving them weapons. And so they've certainly been backing them. And of course, Russia has been really benefiting from this war because of high oil prices and because the sanctions on Russian oil have been waived for 1 month by the United States and then just for a second month. So the Russian economy isn't doing that well, but they're certainly benefiting from this economically. On the other hand, Putin doesn't want to alienate President Trump. He still wants the president to force Ukraine to give up territory to Russia that Russia doesn't control. So for Putin, it's a balancing act, but he's really trying to show that Russia is still a player in the Middle East, having certainly lost out in Venezuela, of course, in Syria, before all of this happened. So he's playing this, I would say, pretty well at the moment.
So, Dr. Stent, you think he's successfully showing the world that Russia is a player in the Middle East, at least a player in Iran right now?
I think he is. I mean, Russia has certainly lost some of its clout in the Middle East because of events over the past couple of years, and certainly because the US and Israel were able to do this without obviously informing Russia. So I think what Russia is trying to do also is to show, yes, we're still here. We may be, bogged down in Ukraine on the one hand, but we're still a player in the Middle East. So it's kind of, and I think the other thing we have to remember is that Russia has also cultivated good ties with the Gulf states. It's got the OPEC plus with Saudi Arabia and other countries. And so it's a little bit difficult for Russia to the extent that these Gulf partners of Russia have now been attacked by Iran. And as we've seen, these Gulf partners are now signing agreements with Ukraine to give them the technology to improve their, to improve their own drones.
So what does the investing public, the U.S. public, need to understand about this relationship between Iran and Russia in particular? Because I'm also wondering, how does Russia complicate any U.S. efforts towards a ceasefire?
Well, I think they have to understand that this is still an important partnership for Russia.
And will stay that way, Angela? Will stay that way?
I think it will stay that way because the Iranians are going to probably be more dependent on Russia, depending how all of this works out at the end. So yes, that's there to say. And as long as the Russians support the Iranians, they've also been able to push back against the U.S. Now we're in a ceasefire period. Straits of Hormuz are obviously closed, but that partnership is going to remain. Yes.
Has this war been net good for Russia, apart from the higher oil prices, the sanctions easing, but also on its own war and its invasion of Ukraine? Attention has shifted from that part of the world in Eastern Europe to the Middle East right now. How does Putin view that internally?
Yeah, I think that's also a bonus for Russia. The U.S. has turned its attention away from that conflict. So I said before that, the Russians would like Trump to force Zelensky to give up territory. That I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So from the Russian point of view, it's okay not to have the U.S. involved in negotiations at the moment, because they can just continue to, what they're trying to do is to take back more territory. They're not doing very well at the moment. Ukrainians are doing much better. But yes, I think for them, it's a bonus that attention has turned away from that conflict.
Angela, does Russia want the uranium, the enriched uranium?
I think it does. So in 2015, they took the enriched uranium after the Obama administration had agreed on the JCPOA, that agreement with Iran that the Russians were also involved with. So the Russians would be quite happy to take that. But of course, so far, the Trump administration has said that it doesn't accept that. And I think President Trump has said he wants the U.S. to take it.
Over the last few years, when we've had a chance to talk to you, we've asked you how you think the war between Russia's invasion of Ukraine will end. I'm going to ask you now about the war between the U.S. and Iran, and certainly Israel there as well. How does that war end?
That's a much more difficult one because, there has been regime change in Iran, but you have a regime that's, even more radicalized. And Iran so far looks as if it's done pretty well out of this conflict, despite the assassinations and the loss of weapons and things like that, because it's now controlling the Straits of Hormuz. So I think in the end, there are negotiations. There'll have to be more negotiations, but I think it's unlikely that the Iranians are going to, say that they will totally give up their nuclear weapons program. And in the end, you may have to come back to an agreement that's somewhat similar to the JCPOA, the agreement that the Trump administration pulled out in its first term. Yeah. Maybe it'll have somewhat different terms, but just trying to restrict the pace at which Iran can develop a nuclear weapons system.
And just let's not forget China's out there too, who of course is allied with Iran and Russia, no doubt about it.